I built the life I thought I was supposed to want. The career, the house, the title on the door, the kind of success you can point to, the kind other people nod at when you mention it. And somewhere around 80 years old, sitting alone in a house I worked 40 years to afford, I asked myself a question I had never once stopped to ask before. Was any of this actually what I wanted, or was it just what I was chasing? If you've ever caught yourself wondering the same thing, wondering whether the life you built is the same as the life you actually meant to live, you are not foolish and you are not alone. I want to tell you what I spent 40 years chasing, what I finally caught, and what I learned the moment I realized it wasn't what I thought it would be. Stay with me. This one might change how you spend whatever years you have left. I was 24 years old when I decided what my life was going to be about. I didn't sit down and consciously choose it, not in any deliberate way. It was more that I absorbed it, the way you absorb the temperature of a room without noticing you're doing it. I grew up without much. My father worked with his hands his whole life and never had enough to show for it, not in the way the world measures these things. I watched him struggle, watched my mother stretch a dollar further than it should have gone, and somewhere in that childhood I formed a conclusion that I never questioned for the next 4 decades. Money and standing are what make a man safe, what make a man matter. That conclusion became the engine of my entire adult life. Every decision I made after that, in one way or another, ran through that single filter. Will this make me more secure? Will this make me look more successful? Will this move me further from the version of life my father had, and closer to the version I had decided I deserved instead? I want to walk you through what 40 years of chasing that conclusion actually looked like, because I don't think ambition fully captures it. I worked long hours. Not occasionally, consistently for decades. I told myself, and told my family that this was temporary, that once we got past this stretch, once this promotion came through, once this business found its footing, things would ease up. They never eased up. Each level of success simply revealed the next level I hadn't reached yet. I missed things, not dramatically, not in a single catastrophic absence, but steadily, the way a slow leak empties a tank without anyone noticing until it's nearly dry. Dinners, school events, ordinary Tuesday evenings that I told myself didn't matter individually, because there would be other Tuesdays. There were other Tuesdays. I just wasn't there for most of them either. By the time I was 55, I had achieved most of what I had set out to achieve. A house considerably larger than the one I'd grown up in. A position that came with real authority and real respect, a net worth that by any reasonable measure would have looked like enormous success to the 24-year-old version of myself standing in front of that first small office. I remember standing in the driveway of that house one evening, having just signed the papers that finalized the purchase, and waiting to feel the thing I had assumed I would feel: satisfaction, arrival, the sense that I had finally reached the place I'd been running toward for 30 years. I didn't feel it, not the way I expected to. What I felt instead was a brief, hollow quiet, followed almost immediately by a new thought. Now what's next? I had crossed a finish line I'd spent decades imagining, and instead of stopping, I had already started looking for the next one. I want to be honest about what this pattern cost the people closest to me, because I think that's the part that matters most, and the part one avoided looking at directly for far too long. My children grew up with a father who was financially generous and emotionally somewhat absent. I provided. I want to be fair to myself in saying that I provided steadily, reliably, in ways that mattered and that I don't regret. But providing and being present are not the same thing, and for a long stretch of my life I genuinely believed they were close enough to interchangeable that the difference didn't matter much. It mattered. I understand that now in a way I didn't understand it then. My oldest daughter told me once, years later when she was already an adult with children of her own, that her clearest memory of her childhood was not a vacation or a holiday or anything dramatic. It was the sound of my car pulling into the driveway after she had already gone to bed, night after night for years. She wasn't angry when she told me this. She said it gently, almost as an observation rather than an accusation, but it landed on me with a weight that took me a long time to fully absorb. The pursuit didn't stop at 55 or 60 or even 65. I want to be clear about that, because I think the pattern is more persistent than people expect. Each new level of success simply reframed what enough meant. When I had the house, I wanted the house paid off faster than necessary. When the business was stable, I wanted it larger. When my title carried real weight in my industry, I wanted it to carry more. This is not a unique observation. Researchers who study satisfaction and well-being have a name for this pattern: the tendency for achievement to provide only temporary lift before a person adjusts to the new level and starts wanting more. I didn't know that term at the time. I only knew the lived experience of it, arriving somewhere I had once thought would be enough, and discovering, almost immediately, that it wasn't. I kept running on that treadmill well into my 70s, even after my body had started sending signals that the pace I was keeping no longer matched the man I had become. There was a specific moment, around the time I turned 76, that finally interrupted the pattern in a way nothing else had managed to. I want to be careful here, because this is not a story about a particular diagnosis or a piece of medical advice. I'm not going to describe the specifics because that's not what matters for this story, and because I don't think the particulars of any one person's health situation are mine to use as a teaching tool in detail. What matters is simply this: I had a health scare serious enough to make me sit in a waiting room for several hours, genuinely uncertain about what the coming months might hold. And in that waiting room, with nothing to do but sit with my own thoughts, I found myself doing something I had successfully avoided doing for 50 years. I asked myself what I actually had to show for the life I'd built, if the answer mattered the way I'd always assumed it would. The house, the title, mostly retired from by then, but still part of how I introduced myself in my own head. The accounts, the investments, the things that had organized my entire understanding of what a good life looked like. Sitting in that waiting room, none of it felt like the right answer to the question that actually mattered in that moment, which was simply, who do you want beside you, and have you spent your life in a way that makes that likely? The health scare turned out to be manageable. I'm not going to pretend it was a dramatic brush with death, because it wasn't, and I don't want to borrow more weight from it than it actually carried. But it was enough of an interruption that I couldn't simply return to my previous pattern without at least examining it first. I called my daughter, the same one who had mentioned the sound of my car in the driveway, and I asked if I could come visit, not for a holiday, not for an occasion, just to visit, on an ordinary weekend, with no particular agenda beyond being there. She was surprised. I could hear it in her voice. In our family, visits had always had a reason attached to them: a birthday, a graduation, a holiday that demanded my presence. A visit with no reason at all was apparently unusual enough to be worth noting. I went. I stayed for 4 days. I helped her son with a school project. I sat on her porch in the evenings and talked about nothing in particular. I was, for the first extended stretch I could remember, simply present, without an agenda, without checking my phone every 20 minutes for something related to work. It felt strange, genuinely strange, in a way that surprised me with how unfamiliar simple presence had become after decades of treating time as something to be optimized. I want to tell you what I started to understand, slowly, over the months following that visit. The 40 years I had spent chasing money and standing had not been wasted entirely. I want to be fair about that, because I think there's a version of this story that becomes too harsh on the younger man I was, and I don't think that harshness is accurate or useful. The security I built mattered. My children never went without. I was able to help them in real, tangible ways at several points in their adult lives. A down payment here, a difficult medical bill there, opportunities they could take because they knew there was a floor beneath them if things went wrong. That floor came from the 40 years of chasing. I don't regret having built it. What I regret is something more specific. I regret believing for most of that time that the floor was the point, that providing security was sufficient on its own without also providing presence. I had one half of what mattered and had convinced myself, for most of 4 decades, that it was the whole thing. I went through old photographs around this same time, another thing I hadn't done in years, having always told myself I didn't have time for that kind of looking backward. What struck me going through them was how many of the pictures from my children's growing up years I wasn't in, not because I was always working when the camera came out, simply because even when I was home I often wasn't fully present enough to be the one someone thought to photograph. I was a kind of background presence in my own family's visual history, there, technically, but not quite at the center of the moments that mattered. I sat with that observation for a long time. It wasn't a comfortable one, but I think it was an honest one, and I had spent most of my life avoiding exactly that kind of honest accounting in favor of accounting I was more comfortable with, the kind involving numbers in a ledger rather than presence in a photograph. My grandson a few years ago came to me at a moment when he was deciding between a higher-paying job that would require significant travel and a lower-paying one that would keep him closer to home and his young family. He asked what I thought he should do. I want to be honest about what I told him because it was not the advice the younger version of myself would have given. I didn't tell him what to choose specifically. That wasn't mine to decide, and every family's circumstances are different enough that I don't think there's a single correct answer for everyone in that position. But I told him what I wished someone had told me at his age. I told him that money buys a floor, and a floor matters, and there's no virtue in pretending otherwise when you have people depending on you. But I told him that a floor is not a ceiling, and somewhere along the way I had confused chasing a higher ceiling with the actual point of having a floor in the first place. I told him to ask himself regularly, not just whether a choice would make him more secure, but who he wanted beside him when he was 80, and whether his daily choices were actually building toward having that person still close enough to be there. He sat with that for a long time. I don't know exactly what he decided in the end or whether my words mattered much in that decision, but I felt, telling him that like I was finally putting the 40 years of chasing to some use beyond the bank account it had produced. I made some changes in the years following that hospital waiting room. Smaller changes than you might expect given how I'm describing this. I didn't sell everything and move into a cabin somewhere. I didn't reject the life I'd built in any dramatic gesture. What I changed mostly was my relationship to time. I started visiting my children without occasions attached. I started calling not to check on logistics or coordinate plans but simply to talk, the way you'd talk to a friend rather than manage a relationship. I started slowly measuring my days by a different standard than the one I'd used for 40 years, not by what I had acquired or accomplished, but by who I had actually been present with and how fully I had been present while I was there. It is a much harder standard to track than money. There's no ledger for it, no number that tells you clearly whether you're succeeding or falling behind. I think that's part of why I avoided it for so long. It offered none of the clean, measurable feedback that chasing money and standing had always provided, but it is, I have come to believe, the only standard that actually matters in the end. I am 81 years old now. The house is smaller than the one I drove up to that evening years ago, feeling that hollow quiet instead of the satisfaction I'd expected. I downsized a few years back, partly for practical reasons, but partly because the larger house had started to feel like a monument to a version of success I no longer fully believed in. I have fewer things now than I've had in decades. I also have, I think, more of what actually mattered all along, though it took me most of a long life to understand the difference. I cannot get the 40 years back. I want to be honest about that, because I don't believe in offering false comfort about things that genuinely cannot be undone. The Tuesday evenings I missed are simply gone. The years my children spent growing up mostly without my full presence happened the way they happened, and no amount of presence now changes that history. But I have learned something about what remains available, even after 40 years of chasing the wrong measure of a good life. The measure can change starting today, regardless of how long you've used the wrong one. If you are listening to this and recognizing something of your own life in what I've described, the chasing, the achievement that never quite satisfies, the people you've loved who got less of you than they deserved because you were busy building a floor you'd already finished building, I want to say a few things to you plainly. You are not foolish for having chased what you chased. Most of us are handed, early in life, a story about what makes a person matter, and most of us spend decades acting on that story before we ever stop to examine whether it's actually true. The years you've already spent chasing cannot be returned to you. That is simply a fact of how time works, and I won't pretend otherwise. But the years you have left are not yet spent, and the standard you measure them by, the thing you're actually chasing starting today, is still entirely within your choosing. I spent 40 years chasing money and standing, believing they were the whole answer to a good life. They were part of an answer. I don't regret the floor I built. I don't think anyone should feel ashamed for wanting security, especially if they came from circumstances where security was scarce. But I spent too many of those years believing that chasing was the same as living, that accumulation was the same as presence, that providing for people was the same as actually being there with them. It took me until nearly 80 years old to understand the difference. I would have preferred to understand it sooner, but I have learned, slowly, that understanding it late is considerably better than never understanding it at all. If something in this reached you today, if you've spent years chasing something that turned out to be less than you hoped, or if you're in the middle of that chase right now and wondering whether it's the right one, I'd like to hear about it. Leave a comment. Tell me what you've been chasing. Tell me what you think you'd find if you finally caught it. This is the conversation I started this channel to have. The honest one, not the easy one. If this reached you, please subscribe. We're here every week talking plainly about the years that deserve more honesty than they usually get. Thank you for spending this time with me today. At my age, I've learned not to take anyone's time for granted, yours included.